Good afternoon for everybody on the East Coast, and good morning for those of you who are on the West Coast. My name is Carl Peckman. I'm the director of the National Regulatory Research Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first of 3 webinars covering the financial impact of COVID-19. This pandemic has all of us learning new things, doing things in ways that we're not accustomed to, and case in point, we had intended this to be a video conference, and we've run into some technical issues associated with it. Happily, I think that we're on firmer ground when it comes to the practice of regulation. And over the course of these 3 webinars, we'll be talking about the practice of regulation, the issues associated with COVID, and lessons learned from other financial difficulties that the utility industry has experienced. Just a little bit about NRRI for those of you who are not familiar with us. We're the National Regulatory Research Institute. We're, in effect, NARUC's research arm. We provide service to the nation's public utility commissioners, the commissions and their staffs, as well as the broader regulatory community. We do so in 3 ways. We provide broad research, targeted assistance to utility commissions, and also training. We try to respond to the needs of the regulatory community, and as a consequence, we felt that it was important to delve into issues of utility rate making associated with COVID. We've been very pleased to work with Cheryl Banks, the chair of the NARUC Staff Subcommittee on Finance and Accounting, who is co-hosting this series of webinars. The first webinar will look at the problems that we're facing with respect to COVID-19. The second webinar, which will be on May 27th, will look at tools available to the regulatory community for evaluating and addressing issues with respect to COVID-19 costs. And the third webinar will look at lessons learned from public utility financial challenges in other contexts, and what we can learn from those contexts to what we're experiencing now. With that, I would like to turn over to my co-moderator, Cheryl Banks, to introduce the speakers that we have today. Cheryl?
Thank you, Carl. Welcome, everyone. Today, we have 4 distinguished presenters who will be providing insight into the financial impact of COVID-19. Our first presenter is Bob Mudge, principal with the Brattle Group. He previously served as Brattle's COO and treasurer. His experience includes providing expert advice to electric utility clients on matters including rate design, financial restructuring, and asset valuation. Thank you, Bob, for sharing your insights with us today, and if you would just go ahead and lead us off.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. I now see my slides on the screen, and let me just be sure I can move them. Let's see, I'm not yet seeing that I can switch pages here. It looks as though somebody's, okay, there's a bit of a lag. All righty. Well, let me march into this. Thanks to NRRI and everyone for inviting me to present this afternoon. A number of colleagues and I have started a series of periodic reviews of the impact of COVID on the electricity and related industries. and I'll be speaking today from slides that we just published yesterday, our second installment covering experience to date through April. And these are sort of, comprehensive and therefore a little bit unruly and cover lots of ground, and I won't have time today to delve into each feature. But it does remind me of an anecdote, if you'll indulge me, from years ago when I was in the audience for a talk given by Amory Lovins, who's quite encyclopedic, as people on the call may know. And on this occasion, he had, this was many years ago, so the technology was different. He had an enormous stack of transparencies that he put down on an overhead projector. But again, as in my case, there were way too many to cover at the time. So what he would do with this huge undifferentiated stack of transparencies that all looked like each other, he would selectively and somewhat magically reach into the middle of the stack, pull out the right transparency, and illustrate his point without breaking a sweat. So I'm going to attempt to do the same in terms of reaching into the slide deck, which I assume people have already have, but you can get it on Brattle's website if you don't. And I'm going to try to keep the discussion focused principally on the electric sector, although obviously fuels play a role there. And I'm going to try to organize the introduction around our executive summary, which is based on high-level takeaways in a number of dimensions. The two that are shown on this page are the pandemic itself, and of course there's a huge amount of information in the public domain on that, and the economy. But just very briefly, we see, particularly in the Northeast, some easing of the conditions that have caused so much alarm in recent weeks. Meanwhile, however, infection rates are increasing at a rapid pace in other parts of the country, and the forecast death rate by IHME and at the University of Washington and other prognosticators is sliding upward even as we speak. Anyone who observed the Senate hearings yesterday knows there's a very robust difference of opinion about what to expect in coming months. Again, focused back on what's happened so far, unemployment may be the single most dramatic impact to date. Really unprecedented in recent times. Unemployment figures similar to the Great Depression many decades ago. Whether the lost jobs are temporary, I think remains to be seen. Increasingly, people are thinking that some of them may be more permanent. Recent second quarter GDP estimates are in the realm of 30 to 40% drops. I think Goldman Sachs came out with a new report this morning continuing to forecast that level of GDP loss in the near term, but a pretty sharp recovery thereafter. In the meantime, the stock market is, by some measures, levitating relative to what's happening in the general economy. Overall PE ratio around 20 times at the end of April. And I'm going to experiment now with scrolling to slides that may be useful to illustrate what's going on. Here, this is a focus on adverse effects occurring in the second quarter. And perhaps the item of greatest interest is a Price Waterhouse graphic on the bottom of the page that illustrates the impact across industry sectors. Intuitively, way over on the left-hand side, transportation, airlines, so on and so forth, most adversely affected. By contrast, utilities are, in this depiction, if anything, experiencing upticks in GDP. Not sure that that's quite supportable, but and then healthcare way over on the right-hand side. That said, I think more recent data conveys that if only because of the forestalling of elective surgery, the healthcare industry may be suffering pretty adverse GDP effects as well. Here's just a very quickly a depiction of Goldman's forecast for GDP effects as of a week or so ago. They have an update, as I mentioned. It's got a deeper trough in Q2 and a stronger recovery thereafter. So that kind of expectation may explain why stock prices are relatively high. So back to our executive summary. Oil markets, very volatile for reasons that perhaps are beyond just COVID, but extremely negative prices very briefly in the third week of April. But perhaps more fundamentally, oil futures remain pretty depressed. And I'm not going to dwell on that since it's a little bit remote from immediate utility effects. Natural gas markets are interesting. Prices are actually a little bit elevated, and this is based on not much movement in observable demand other than for LNG exports, which are quite sharply down. But one key feature of this is an increasing spread between near-term gas and winter forwards, which has gotten wider than $1 per MMBTU. I'll skip the graphic, but that's accompanied by traders reversing out short positions that marked the early stages of the COVID pandemic, and the preponderance of natural gas traders are now long, such that natural gas prices might be expected to be more elevated in coming months, and that could be all the more so in a stronger economy. To date, and again, I should say that the bulk of our intention in this presentation is meant to be retrospective. What have we seen so far? Electric load reduction has been pretty broadly experienced, pretty intuitively, albeit at various levels around the country. The Northeast, the New York ISO in particular, has had the greatest load reductions. In April, the impact was about double that observed for March, 6.5% versus 3.5%. And those numbers represent the increment of load reduction once having accounted for seasonality, so reasonably attributable to COVID. The actual overall reduction between March and April being bigger than that. Likely that the big driver of that load reduction is commercial and industrial, since residential load is somewhat up. Load shapes not showing huge differences. In terms of the load reduction effects on generation, mostly falling on coal and gas. Renewable energy remaining relatively robust, except in states like California, where, if only because it's now a bigger piece of the energy pie, curtailments in certain hours of the day have been greater. Let me just focus on a couple of slides that illuminate that point on and apologies for skipping over so much of this. Here's a depiction of the load reductions between or since February, in addition to a comparison to the 4-year average for those months, and that's how we derive the 6.5% reduction in April. Tracking those observations from raw data, the ISOs are also reporting similar magnitudes of load reduction, ranging from 3% or so at the low end in ISO New England to higher levels of load reduction in the mid-teens for the New York ISO. Electricity prices, LMPs, have also shown the impact. They're down month over month, varying by geography, anywhere from 5 to 20%. If one looks back to last year at this time, the LMPs are off by much larger percentages, and in particular in New York, where they're off by more than 50%. Just thinking about how investment and capacity may ultimately be affected, the EIA forecasts that utilities will defer investment equal to about 4.9 gigawatts through the year. This may or may not, create a long-term ripple. If one confines the expected effect of COVID to the impact from social distancing alone, one might imagine that we're at a bit of a nadir, but there are likely to be other ripple effects that could cause longer deferrals. That said, interest rates are low, lots of counteracting forces. Credit criteria probably getting tighter, supply chain disruptions are likely to occur, not least from security motivated executive orders. The renewables sector forms kind of an interesting segment of expected investment. There's a bit of tension naturally as the end of the year looms with expirations of tax credits that are very important to that sector. While it's hard to tell so far what level of activity has occurred in terms of renewable new build, the unemployment figures for that sector portend a potential slowdown that could cause problems as the year progresses, and some industry observers are thinking that may correspond to a need for industry consolidation. Financial impacts. Notwithstanding the load reduction, it stands to reason that utility revenues may be muted a bit relative to the load losses. And this is because residential demand is up. Their bills tend to be largely volumetric in nature. And so every additional megawatt hour is an additional dollar or additional dollars of revenue. Whereas there's a more of a hedge on the C&I side, where a bigger portion of the bill is in demand terms. In the end, it turns out that so far S&P has downgraded its credit outlook for only 3 IOUs, or had as of the end of April. So they are seeing the effects as muted. They may also be taking into account some of the regulatory mitigants, both in the nature of existing decoupling regimes, as well as those being fashioned specifically to address COVID. We're wondering whether some of those deferrals of cost, as in the form of relief for ratepayers who are unable to cover their bills, may lead to rate shock in the medium term, and therefore potentially calling for structures such as rate levelization or securitization of various kinds. I'm realizing I'm consuming more time than I meant, and I think I should stop at that point, and obviously can respond to questions as we go. So I'll stop there, Carl.
Thank you, Bob. Cheryl, do you want to do the next introduction?
Yes, certainly. Our next presenter is Jim Jenkins, and he's the Vice President of Regulatory Services for American Water. Jim has over 30 years of experience in the utility sector, and his vast experience includes oversight of rate case and regulatory filings to support regulatory strategy and policy initiatives across the enterprise. Welcome, Jim, and thank you for your participation.
Jim, I believe you're muted.
Yes, thank you, Cheryl. And since we're having some technical difficulties, can we do a quick sound check?
You sound great, Jim.
Good. Well, hey, thanks everyone, and really miss a lot of folks on this call, and look forward to seeing folks down the road. And unfortunately, we don't have the active video because I was able to go out to an area that was open, and I got a haircut, and I'm in a shirt and tie and a coat, which hasn't happened for over 60 days. So feeling pretty good right now. So anyway, in terms of the topic, I very much appreciate the opportunity to address this topic. And at American Water, we understand that we have a very important role to play during this health emergency. We actually operate water and wastewater utilities across 14 states, providing essential services, as you can imagine, for hygiene, hospitals, sanitation, and fire protection. And we actually do this supporting a population base of 15 million people. So we take this role seriously, and we have and will continue to work constructively with all stakeholders. And just like Bob mentioned, we're at the initial phases of this, but I'd like to structure my discussion around what I consider like 4 key areas, and speak to what are we experiencing, what steps are we undertaking to address the COVID-19 issue, what financial impact is the COVID-19 issue having on American Water and other utilities, and what are our plans to address the financial impacts. So in terms of what we're experiencing, I had the opportunity to look at a J.D. Power pulse survey that was taken towards the end of April related to COVID-19, and I think it captured it best and effectively is telling us what Bob just mentioned and what we already know. We're certainly experiencing challenging and unprecedented times, and virtually all of our customers, with respect to the water sector and other utility sectors for that matter, have been impacted. And according to this survey, 30% of them expect their financial situation will be worse or much worse as the health emergency continues. And this extends across all income groups. Approximately 3% say they are unlikely to be able to pay their next month's water bill. So from our perspective, this is unlikely to change anytime soon. Bob mentioned it, but the latest data I was able to pull off, we've got a little over 21 million people that have reported that have lost jobs in April, and the unemployment rate is approximately 15%, which is up from a 4.4% in March. So certainly challenging the times ahead, and our customers are going to be challenged in order to pay their bills. In terms of our frontline employees and what we're experiencing, we couldn't be any more prouder with our employees, and certainly the frontline employees, because they're our utility heroes and are providing our customers with essential water and wastewater services during this public health emergency. They're the folks that are ensuring that water and wastewater services is continuous and not impacted. And then in terms of what we've seen across the 50 states and the District of Columbia, all such states have had mandatory or voluntary moratoriums on utility disconnections. Some are requiring or requesting reconnections for customers who were previously disconnected for non-payment. And American Water, it was actually ahead of the mandate curve. We voluntarily implemented these measures on our own just prior to many of the mandates around mid-March. And why did we do that? It was just the right thing to do for our customers. So very happy with our executive leadership team at American Water and the various presidents, making that call. What steps is American Water taking to address the health emergency? We continue to monitor the COVID-19 status, and we're taking steps to mitigate risk to our company and employees and communities we serve. And we focused, primarily on three areas at this point. First is the care and safety of our employees and their families. Second, the safety of customers and the communities we serve. And then finally, just in the execution in our business continuity plans in order to make sure we continue to provide clean, safe, and reliable water services to our communities. Safety, like other utilities, it's our top priority. We've implemented a required work from home policy. That's where I'm at today, and where possible, as well as social distancing and other enhanced safety measures for employees and customers. We've suspended all non-emergency in-home appointments and limited the amount and nature of contact with customers during applicable field appointments. And as mentioned earlier, we've suspended all the billing related shutoffs and suspended late fees and have restored services to customers who were previously shut off for non-payment across our footprint. And then we're working with our customers who are experiencing financial hardships by offering customer assistance programs and access to low-income programs. We're also communicating to customers about our H2O program, which is actually it's a separate program we have. It's an emergency assistance program that's funded by American Water operating customer companies and voluntary customer donations. And these programs are administered by third parties, third parties in order to supplement funding that customers so desperately need to pay their bills. We are also proactively working in Washington. The water and wastewater sector does not have a LIHEAP program like the energy sector has. So we're really working with member companies and NAWC to really advocate that, to help create a fund that could help our low-income water utility customers. We think now is the time that we should get a program like this and put on equal par with the energy sector. In addition to this, we've provided a $500,000 donation to our charitable water foundation to help fund COVID relief across the United States. And then we've made an additional $100,000 donation to our charitable foundation to a Feeding America program that funds food banks across the nation. So that's what we're doing in terms of addressing the health emergency. And then in terms of the next step is what financial impact is this health emergency having on our utility? And I think, first, it's critical to remember water utilities are highly capital intensive. And like other utilities, we have high fixed costs relative to variable costs. So we often cite in our sector that 90% of our costs are fixed. And to complicate matters with respect to cash flow, 70% of these fixed costs are collected through volumetric rates. So thus cash flows and consistent revenue collection is a real challenge in our sector. And the COVID-19 situation, accelerates these kind of challenges. And initial steps that American Water has taken American Water has actually taken some initial steps to focus on its liquidity. So in addition to our $2.2 $1.25 billion revolving credit facility that supports our working capital and capital spending needs. On March 20th, we entered into a $750 million 364-day loan agreement, and we drew down $500 million of that cash immediately to be ready to help support our service obligations. So thus, a utility our size, we were able to use our balance sheet and to meet our challenges associated with this public health emergency. The first thing we focused on was liquidity. Second is resulting from the health emergency, we've incurred and we expect to continue to incur incremental costs. And as we talked about with the shut-off moratoriums and the suspension of fees and related customer communication costs that we've encountered, although we can't say with specificity what our costs are today, we know that they're increasing, and we certainly expect our uncollectible expense, bad debts, collections, and write-offs will increase, and we will continue to work to quantify those. The effects of COVID-19, Bob mentioned on the revenue side with the energy side, we're seeing similar impacts. It's really early, but certainly on the residential side, with respect to our residential load, it's higher. What are we doing? We're at home, hopefully practicing good hygiene, washing our hands, etc. So we would expect our residential load to be up. However, on the commercial and industrial loads, they are trending down with business closures and just general slowdowns associated with the stay-at-home orders. So this is something we're watching closely. It's too soon to tell, but it's something we're definitely monitoring. In terms of, another area that's important to highlight, non-billed revenue associated with not charging late fees. We're not doing that now, nor are we disconnecting people or reconnecting people. So we've stopped any fees that were associated with that. So we're experiencing and will experience, as long as this health emergency continues, a loss of those revenues. And then finally, I think we're incurring additional costs like you'd think in terms of in the area of safety, including PPE. We're buying masks, gloves for employees, sanitizers, deep facility, cleaning, and then looking towards additional medical equipment that we'll have to acquire in order to help with COVID-19 testing as we return to work. And then any other costs that are just, that we're just not aware of right now. We're working to just keep that in mind as we work through this public health emergency. Then in terms of the fourth area is, what are our plans to address the financial impact? So, and it's an ongoing effort. In American Water, we've been working constructively with our Public Service Commission, other stakeholders, as everyone looks to address utility response measures, customer protection, and cost recovery for all regulated utilities in each applicable jurisdiction. We're certainly in uncertain times. We don't know with respect to the duration, the type, and the extent of how the COVID-19 and this public health emergency is going to impact us, but we certainly expect it's going to have a financial impact on utilities like American Water. We've been very encouraged with orders that have already been entered. In fact, we've seen 5 across our footprint, and proceedings in process that address deferring of costs. And then proceedings are in process and discussions are taking place with key stakeholders and jurisdictions as well. No one could have predicted this health emergency, utilities included, and so none of us planned for these additional costs that we're currently incurring. And we're happy to just have a dialogue and have a discussion with that. And then second, very important is, and we've been ordered in many cases, and we're doing this across the American system, is to identify, track, and evaluate the costs that I was talking about, as well as any lost revenues related to the COVID-19 and this public health emergency. And then to the extent the emergency stay-at-home orders result in savings, such as traveling less, we'll track those savings as well and offset those against any approved deferrals that we get. So utilities like American Water, and certainly we've started to express opinions in this area, will be, seeking authority to book a regulatory asset for these increased costs. And then, one of the things with the water sector, and the broader utility sector, but especially the water that we've talked about in many forums, is we don't have widespread formula rate making, none in the American system, limited decoupling mechanisms across the sector. And I'm not, certainly in American water, we don't have any uncollectible riders, which we discussed is going to be a likely increasing cost as this pandemic continues. And the health authority measures and stay-at-home orders continue as well. So we don't have those measures. So with that, we may need to and ask for rider recovery treatment as these costs get material. So those are the things that we're looking at in what we're experiencing. And I think just in conclusion, I'd end by saying the obvious that Bob was highlighting and why we're all here. We're certainly in unprecedented times, and customers still remain at the center of what we all do, and they're extremely important. And it's up to utilities like us to provide essential services in our sector, water and wastewater, and that's what we're doing. And we're continuing our measures to protect our most vulnerable customers throughout this health emergency. And AW made such a commitment on March 12th when we temporarily stopped disconnections, stopped notices, reconnected customers, waived reconnection fees, and stopped late payment fees. So we sincerely thank commissions for their leadership and look forward to working collaboratively with all stakeholders to develop a meaningful approach to mitigate the current and future impacts of COVID-19. So with that said, happy to take any questions at the end of the panel discussion.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts with us. Our next presenter is the Honorable Tony Clark. Tony is a senior advisor with Wilkinson Barker Nauer LLP. And in this role, Tony provides clients with expert advice on a variety of regulatory and public policy matters. Tony is a former FERC commissioner, a former commissioner and chair of the North Dakota Public Service Commission, and former president of NRRI. He was also a former state legislator for the great state of North Dakota. It's my pleasure to welcome Tony.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I just want to say, first of all, that the past few months, while they've certainly been challenging, have really been, in some ways, some of the finest hours for the utility industry, and I think for the regulators and regulatory commissions that oversee them. We all learn in a crisis that essential services are called that for a reason. They really are essential, and the fact that you've got utility operators and line workers and control room operators keeping the energy flowing, sometimes in heroic conditions, is a testament to the work that's being done. The comments that I'm going to be making today are, I sort of talk about a few different industries. The first portion of my comments probably are most directly aligned and responsive to some of the things that I think utility commissions will be seeing in the electricity, probably most especially, but also the gas distribution business. And then I'm going to turn just briefly and talk about some of the other industries to be thinking about. Our firm does a fair amount of work both in the sort of traditional electric and gas utility side, regulatory side, but also in telecommunications, and given my background at FERC, thinking about some of the industries that FERC regulates. I know this is more of a state-focused crowd, but I did want to bring some of those things to the front too, because I think federal regulators will be dealing with similar issues, and it might be instructive to think about what they're going to be thinking about too. So first of all, the way that we've been thinking about this at the firm, and we recently wrote a white paper on this, and we'll probably be having a series of them coming out, is at least in this initial part of the COVID crisis, to think about that there are really sort of two phases moving forward here. One, a more short-term phase dealing with the impacts of COVID, and then one, a longer-term phase that you're probably going to see over the next 12 or 18 months. So the first phase, and you all are in the thick of it right now, is oftentimes really on the expense side of the ledger. It's the most immediate issues that come out. It arises out of things like no disconnect policies and the expectation that there's going to be an increase in bad debt expense. Every investor-owned utility, lots and lots of public power utilities and rural cooperatives have all gone on record as saying they're not disconnecting customers. About half the states or more have had some sort of either policy or executive order or regulatory fiat that has instituted no disconnect policies. And these have been an appropriate short-term response to a really unprecedented crisis. And it's, in my opinion, has been handled very appropriately. There is some concern moving forward, and I know NRRI has been active in talking about this, that there have been some pushes at the federal level in Congress to federalize through a top-down process the disconnect policies across the country. I think that would is not a great idea. I recently wrote an op-ed on this, but I noticed that just within the last day or two, this is getting talked about some in one of the House bills that's floating around. There is, in my mind, a great deal of concern about this approach. Utilities are such that they require relatively stable revenues to keep their large fixed cost businesses going. They don't tend to carry lots of piles of cash reserve around on their books. So balancing the interests of consumers and the utility through a state regulatory commission process, in my mind, makes an awful lot of sense. You can tailor it to the specific conditions going on in that state. And we know this has not impacted all states equally. But it seems like you can work through in a manageable way, a difficult but manageable way, if you allow it to be done state by state. I have concerns if you federalize that you're creating a long-term sort of lender of last resort where you're asking utilities to carry on their books an untold amount of societal debt. And ultimately that can cause problems. This is not like the Western energy crisis in a lot of ways. There's certainly lots of differences, but one of the instructive things to learn about the Western energy crisis is you can't have distribution serving, retail serving utilities not have the wherewithal to be able to go out into and access the energy resources that they need to serve customers. If you do, very bad things happen, and you can have reliability problems. So how to deal with it, we've talked about it with some of my other presenters today, but bad debt expense is probably going to be a big one, and dealing with that as a regulatory asset, I'm sure some of you are already dealing with, but on a case-by-case basis, utilities are going to be working on this with their regulatory commissions. One thing that I would flag is it's very important in my mind how disconnect policy gets communicated to the customers of utility companies. Sometimes the state or the utility may talk about a disconnect policy, but it may get interpreted by customers as, well, I don't have to, it's a utility holiday then, which of course it's not. And if people interpret it that way, you could have, as Bob mentioned, a rate shock issue at the end of some period where they realize they have to pay the bill for several months, which will only increase the stress. So that's, I think, one thing to be on the lookout for. Phase two is a little bit longer term, and this, I think, deals more with the revenue side of the equation. As Bob Mudge went through, there's some preliminary analysis that is showing that there's a fairly significant decrease in commercial and industrial load, perhaps even to maybe a little bit more usage in residential load for understandable reasons. To the degree, this is going to have impacts differently in different states depending on the situation of your utility company, how heavily they are in the commercial and industrial side, the nature of the load profile of the utility and of your state and what the impacts are. So all of this is sort of asterisk, but and it's going to be highly dependent on your individual rate design in your own states. But I would just say, to the degree you have implicit subsidies embedded in your rate design, or to the degree you have lots of volumetric charges that are recovering lots of fixed costs. If to the degree you maybe haven't adopted things like pretty straightforward fuel cost adjustments, anything like that during a time when things are not normal for whatever reason is going to have an impact on the revenue side of the utility and will impact the revenue requirements. So thinking through how to rationalize that is going to be really, really important. Some of these things, like getting implicit subsidies out and trying to marry variable costs with variable charges a little bit more closely, and maybe even some things like decoupling, were probably things that made sense to be exploring anyway, given where the industry was heading with more and more DERs and distributed energy resources and power at the edge of the network. But a crisis like the pandemic accelerates the time frame and exacerbates some of the problem with some of those more inefficient rate design issues. So be sure to look at that. Decoupling, which has been mentioned once already, is something to look at. I think decoupling has some benefits clearly and can make sense in a lot of instances. You have to get it right though, and that'll be one of the things for commissions to look forward to going forward. And I say get it right. What I mean by that is you want to make sure that you're not designing the decoupling in such a way that it eats, for example, organic growth that might happen in the system. I think everyone pre-COVID certainly, and I think long-term probably expects that there's going to be more electrification in general, especially with regard to EVs. And if you design decoupling poorly, you can actually end up with in a worse spot than you were if you don't account for that sort of growth. So I think these are all the kinds of things that are on especially the electricity, but also the gas to-do list. In terms of other industries that I'll just touch on briefly here, as we wrote our white paper and got to thinking about other industries, one of the things that struck us is that in a lot of ways, what we said in regards to electric and gas rate-regulated utilities didn't make a lot of sense on the telecommunication side. There are certainly some parallels. Telecom, like electricity and gas, is an essential service, and we know it's an essential service given telework and things like that today. But there's some big differences. One of the biggest being is telecommunications industry is not, and the broadband industry that provides these services is not rate regulated at the state level. Which means that some of the prescriptions that we talk about in the case of a rate-regulated company, like the suggestion of long-term no disconnect policies with a rider that recovers those, or some way to build in the recovery of those costs later on, doesn't work in a competitive industry, because you can't just build it into rates, and you're putting a lot of liability on a company that may never be able to recover it, because a customer can simply switch off the network and go to some other provider. So not only are there some jurisdictional issues that make this much more of a federal issue, but there's some real world consequences of having one industry or a couple of industries be state regulated like oil or like gas and electricity, but telecom not having that same sort of regulatory regime of rate regulation. So things like the Keep America Connected pledge, which most broadband companies have signed on to, seems like an appropriate step in the near term, but some of the other suggestions that we've talked about really don't make as much sense in the telecom sector longer term. Just very briefly, I'll mention a couple of other industries that I've been thinking about given my background at FERC. Regulatory commissions at the federal level, just like at the state level, use different tools to regulate different types of industries. The interstate natural gas industry is regulated primarily on a cost of service basis, where they have stated tariff rates that are either arrived at through a cost of service proceeding or through a settlement process. because of this throughput issue, I assume FERC is going to have to be looking at the rate structure and the revenue structure for these interstates. Chairman Chatterjee last week announced he's going to be holding a FERC workshop that's going to be commissioner-led, a tech conference to sort through some of these issues. To give you another example of a totally different industry and how regulators use different tools to approach different industries, the oil pipeline industry, which, as Bob mentioned, oil has faced probably short-term the biggest impact of maybe any commodity. Oil pipelines primarily are regulated via a price cap that has an index on it that can go up or down. In regular times, that has worked relatively well. We're not in regular times, however, and so I assume there's going to be probably some need for FERC to, just like states, be open to some flexibility in terms of thinking about practical solutions for how to address some of these unique challenges. And that's really where I'll leave it.
Commissioner Clark.
Yep.
I'd like to follow up just to indicate that during our next session, we will be having a discussion of rate unbundling. So that will dovetail very nicely with your comments. Cheryl, would you like to do the next introduction?
Definitely. Our final speaker is John Howitt. He's Senior Policy Advisor at the National Consumer Law Center. John has roughly 40 years of experience in energy policy and programs, and for the past 21, he's worked at the NCLC, where he's managed a multitude of projects related to low-income energy affordability and efficiency programs, and including rate design and metering technology. John, thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge with us today.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and to NRRI for the invitation to participate in this webinar, and to co-presenters. You're tough acts to follow, and especially to the 250 or so folks who have taken some time to join this webinar. And I'm going to try to move relatively quickly so that we've got some time for discussion. I'm sure folks have got questions. So I don't believe I have the ability to advance these slides. So we're going to have to go through the next slide, please. Rigmarole, and apology for that. But at National Consumer Law Center, as Cheryl mentioned, we are a low-income law and policy advocacy group. So we come in with some assumptions and some, some basic premises as advocates that I would like to just to lay out on the table as a preface. On the next slide, there's a reference to the notion of energy security. And for us in our energy and utility work, what this concept applies to really, and I am going to focus on residential, lower income residential ratepayers and general residential ratepayers, as opposed to discussion of the C&I sectors today. But energy security, from our perspective, really applies to it's uninterrupted and affordable access to those energy and utility services that constitute necessities. And what we see when energy security exists is that customers are not receiving disconnection notices or experiencing involuntary disconnections. They're not foregoing other necessities to stay connected to the system, and indoor temperatures are consistent with health and safety objectives. So this isn't to imply that there should never be a disconnect notice or that no customer should ever lose service for non-payment. But when these circumstances exist, I think we can point to sort of a threat or a diminishing of home energy security. On the next slide, there is sort of a brief outline of the extent to which home energy and utility services constitute a necessity. And I think this audience is is familiar with these concepts already. But there are consequences to unwelcome loss of service. People lose their lives or their homes to fire. Food in the refrigerator will spoil. Kids can't do their homework. I think this audience is familiar with that. But now, as Jim mentioned, with the need with COVID-19 for sort of new sanitation protocols and standards, service, the importance and necessity nature of home utility service is really only heightened. I'd like to talk a little bit about disparities in home energy security, starting on the next slide. And we see disparities by state and region. Certainly within states, utility companies within a state we see disparities. And within individual utility service territories, we see disparities within certain customer groups. And just want to talk about that for a moment here. But in looking across the country, we see big differences by region in the consumer protection structure that has been adopted at the state level. Similarly, the bill assistance programs and policies that are available state to state and region to region can vary widely. And the availability of lower income home energy efficiency programs that we know can be effective in helping people afford their bills and maintain comfortable indoor temperatures also vary widely state to state. And it bridging some of these gaps is particularly important as we're looking at this pandemic and the economic fallout that other speakers have addressed. On the next slide, we see that even within states, there are disparities service territory to service territory, certainly with respect to rates and bills, but also with respect to credit and collection protocols that have to do with bill payment agreements or the actual rates of service disconnections. There are different sort of customer service cultures, utility to utility. And we see the practices with respect to uncollectible account write-offs vary within states considerably. As an example, some utilities deal with cash-strapped customers through implementation of programs such as prepaid service, which that's not the topic of today's discussion, but we know that with that approach, we see highly elevated rates of service disconnection among participants. Moving on to the next slide, I think even within individual utility service territories, and this is not news certainly, but there are energy security disparities by income, with lower income households facing disconnections more frequently and reporting foregoing necessities. We see customers with insecure income and benefits which has become particularly relevant given the economic fallout of this crisis, come into play and feed these disparities. Further, we see, and the data bears out that there are disparities in home energy security by race. And I know that as economic regulators, race doesn't always come into the conversation, but given the health effects and the employment effects associated with this crisis, I thought it relevant to raise this issue in this presentation. So moving on to the next slide, this is not going to come to news as new news for folks as well, but we know that there is tremendous variation in home energy burdens. And by that, I mean the proportion of income devoted to home energy service by income category. And this slide, which I'm not going to dwell on, really bears that out. Please take a look when you have more time. But the source of this data, I calculated this using the Residential Energy Consumption Survey data. This is Energy Information Administration source. So on the next slide, getting back to some of these disparities, the 2015 residential survey includes a variable flagging disconnections or loss of heat during the past year due to what customers report as unaffordable utility service or related problems. And we see clear variations by race on this metric that really is a flag of home energy security threats. And I would add here that while one could argue these differences are attributable to differences in income by race, even when we start controlling for income, we see that some of these disparities continue. And on the next slide, that is borne out. If you look down toward the bottom where we see the national totals, we see that the disconnections, due to inability to pay for a bill, and this came from the 2009 residential survey, we do see vast disparities even when you start controlling for income and you look just at households below 150% of the poverty level. So in looking forward at credit and collection policies to ensure home energy security generally, it could be useful to look at targeting resources in ways that get at some of these inequities and start to right some wrongs. Moving forward as quickly as I can, Jim talked about some of this already, and this is not, this doesn't come as any surprise, but the unemployment spike, it has really been unprecedented since the Great Depression, since the 1930s. We're now around 15% unemployment, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Where this will go is a subject of great uncertainty. But with this unemployment certainly comes consequences to utility cash flow and residential customer cash flow. And on the next slide, we see more BLS data that indicates that really tries to, the attempt here is to differentiate between high risk and low risk employment in the economy. And according to the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, 46% of workers are employed in or had been employed in occupations at quote high risk of layoff. that's a big number, and we'll see how that plays out. But it could have some real bearing on the ways in which we design programs and policies to help people stay connected to the system and keep the utilities operating reliably at the same time. The next slide shows who these workers are, or characteristics of workers in high-risk employment occupations. And we see that folks who are at high risk, who either have already or are more likely to lose their jobs quickly going forward, these are folks who are already struggling. The median earnings of these at-risk workers are lower. You see folks with no health insurance at higher rates. Housing cost burden workers tend to be in at-risk occupations. The next job, the next slide further details who the Federal Reserve Bank, this one is the Philadelphia branch, who they see as at particular risk. And you see a greater likelihood among non-white and Latino workers to be in at-risk jobs, renters, folks without a bachelor's degree and over 25 years of age are particularly at risk, or at greater risk of losing their jobs going forward. So the idea here, moving on, is risks that residential customers are facing right now. There are groups of at-risk or customers that are at higher risk. With respect to consumer prices generally, we see, according to the most recent federal data, the CPI is pretty much flat over the last 12 months, down a little bit over the past month. Food prices are up over the last month and relative to the last 12 months. Transportation and fuel is down considerably. The cost of medical care is up. So on the next slide, some of the punchline here is the state of utility credit and collections going forward is highly uncertain. I'm certainly not an epidemiologist, and I don't know how this crisis is going to continue to impact the economy, but it is clear that we are seeing a heightened need for comprehensive monthly reporting of credit and collections data. Some states do an okay job with this, most do not. But the need for current data is absolutely essential in trying to design fair, equitable, and effective utility cost recovery, but also credit and collection protocols that keep vulnerable customers safe. There's a data reporting lag, even where it exists right now, because of that lag, it's very difficult to discern exactly what impact unemployment and the crisis have had on residential arrearages and the likelihood of increased uncollectible accounts. Trying to hurry up here and go to the final slide, the next one. What's next? What are some post-moratorium energy security programs and policies that can be helpful? And what about this notion of utility cost recovery? At NCLC, we are not opposed to the notion of regulatory asset accounts if they're structured well and if they're balanced. We also are advocating as best we can for federal resources to help not only in the telecom sector, as mentioned previously, but across the energy delivery sectors as well. This cost recovery issue is becoming heated in a number of different states, as you folks are aware, but we really advocate with respect to regulatory assets, a balanced approach that takes into account utility cost savings with respect to fuel and cost of capital. And we also feel that the need for enhanced credit and collection protocols is going to remain with us as long as the economy is not on strong footing. So we certainly advocate for restoration of service for any customer who's been shut off. I really appreciate what Jim said about late payment fees. These obviously add costs to customers who are struggling just to make ends meet. It's a longer conversation, but we see late payment fees really as a profit center for many utilities, not all, but many, where their cost of capital is far lower than the late payment fee rates charged to customers. The need for deferred payment agreements that make sense and that are based on customers' actual income and expense circumstances is more important than ever. This is not the way these agreement plans are structured in most states, where there's a fixed recovery time. And similarly, for particularly low-income households, looking at arrearage management or some sort of debt forgiveness structure where timely payment of the current bill results in a partial write-off of prior balances can be a win-win for utility systems and low-income customers. There will be a need for expansion of bill payment assistance programs, assuming the economy continues to be on shaky ground. As weatherization crews are able to get back to work, I hope that we can kind of refocus efforts on whole house, low-income energy efficiency and retrofit opportunities that have been proven to reduce bills and can be delivered at a pretty good cost in most cases, at a pretty low cost. As mentioned previously, we really need better tracking of data on arrearages, disconnections, payment plans, and other metrics that are indicators not only of home energy security, but also help us to design effective credit and collection programs and protocols. So I just wanted to conclude with a note that on the 27th, I'll be back to present some tools, one on data collection and another that provides a template on looking at the costs and benefits, or gauging the costs and benefits associated with consumer protections and bill assistance programs. And finally, a tool that can help regulators assess arrearage scenarios going forward. And with that, I really appreciate the ability to be here and look forward to discussion.
Thank you, John. I just want to point out one other aspect, that the tools that you'll be talking about during the next webinar are provided by NCLC to the regulatory community without charge, and for them to determine their usefulness and things of that sort. I'd also like to follow up on one thing that you mentioned in your talk, which is that during the next webinar, we will also be discussing accounting mechanisms for deferral accounting. And perhaps I'll take the opportunity to ask the first question and then turn it back over to Cheryl to navigate some of the questions that have been submitted. And the question is a general one, which is, one of the macroeconomic impacts of the coronavirus is a drop in interest rates, which, as we know, affects the cost of capital. Would it be appropriate at some point for commissions to revisit rates of return of the regulated utilities? There are going to be a lot of costs that we know of that are going to be added, but is this one factor that might counter some of those increased costs?
Carl, I might respond to that, at least for starters. I think it's absolutely right that interest rates, broadly speaking, are low, and in particular the so-called risk-free rate, or rates associated with government borrowings. But those are not the only component of a utility's cost of capital. One thing that we've noticed and that we illustrate in our deck is that the cost of debt to utilities themselves may be quite a bit higher and increasing in their spreads to treasuries of late. BBB utility bonds are way above their normal spreads to treasuries just now. And the other component, or another component, is the cost of equity. And that has also moved a different direction. So I think the summary answer would be yes, all of these things need to be revisited, but it's not obvious which direction they go.
Okay, thank you. Cheryl, do you want to?
Hey, Carl, this is Jim. I'd like to respond to that too.
Oh, okay, please. Sorry. Forgive me for.
That's okay. And I think Bob did a really good job on the technical end of that. But, issues like that, from my perspective, are what should be determining a company's next general rate cases. We've always got changes in expenses and revenues and capital between rate cases that are taking place. And what we're talking about today is the cost recovery's perspective of changes that are due to governors and commissioners' emergency orders around the country that may have a material impact on our operations. And if you file a rate case and take those things into account, we know how expensive those are. So I just don't think, I appreciate the question, and certainly folks like Bob can speak to the impacts, but I just don't think that's the right question in this environment.
Fair enough.
Thank you. I'm not sure this is the panel who's going to be able to address this question, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway if you have some thoughts on that. So to your knowledge, did some of the smaller utilities, or those structured in a way to allocate less than 500 employees to the utilities, so if they were at a parent company, did they utilize the PPP loans? And if so, the person asked, are those going to be carried generally as liabilities even though the loan may be forgiven? And how does one account for that? And I know we're going to go into a lot more of the detailed accounting in the next webinar, but if someone has any thoughts on that. Okay, that may be a question that would be great for the panel that's coming up in 2 weeks. So we'll hold on to that. Bob, there's a question that was directly to you. Of the 3 utilities that you mentioned that had a credit downgrade from S&P, can you identify those 3?
Yes. I'm just looking for my own copy of the presentation. It's in the materials that were sent around, and the 3, as of the time several days ago when we assembled this deck, were PNM Resources, Texas New Mexico Power Company, and Elite.
Thank you. For Tony, on decoupling, you mentioned that there's you need to do it right. Can you give us an example of an element that would be wrong?
Sure. Yeah, and what I'd refer back to is what I had commented on briefly during my opening remarks, which is that in terms of setting up decoupling, you need to make sure that you're targeting it such that true organic growth on the utilities system isn't eaten by the decoupling mechanism itself. And what I mean by that is, let's say that decoupling, if it doesn't account for that, sort of assumes a certain level of utility load, either growth or decline over a given period of time. But when you have other factors start to come in, and maybe I'm more bullish on the electricity sector than some, but I think long term there actually is going to be growth in terms of load, especially with EVs coming on in a bigger way. And if you design decoupling such that it eats that otherwise organic growth, it can actually have deleterious effects on the utility.
Okay, thank you. And possibly, John, I'm not sure, but the question is, have any utilities expanded the availability of low-income assistance to the newly unemployed that may not have qualified before the current crises?
Well, I know that a number of utilities are looking at what the options are. I hope they don't mind me saying so, but was on the phone with some folks. Well, I'll just say one of the Southern Company utilities is taking a look at just that right now. In New England, I know that the utilities are all looking at ways of expanding what they refer to as arrearage management programs, mentioned where timely payment of a sometimes discounted current bill is met with a reduction of a proportion of a back bill or an arrearage. And I think that been in touch informally so far and formally in a couple of cases with utility commission staff and others who are looking for options to deal with what could be increasing debt among some of the lower income, newly employed residential customers. And if I could real quickly go back to your decoupling question for just a second, I'm personally not opposed to decoupling, and many consumer advocates don't like it because they see it as sort of a loss of an opportunity to revisit companies' cost structures and for other reasons. I think that you can design decoupling where a utility still comes in every maybe 3 years to take a look at changes in the cost structure. And you can incorporate other kind of consumer-friendly design features, such as putting a collar on an increase during any perhaps by quarter or even in an annual adjustment. And finally, if you have a tiered rate structure to put any surcharge on kind of that highest consumption tier and CER credits on that lowest consumption tier. So I agree with Tony that it's all about how you design decoupling as to whether it turns out to be good from sort of a policy perspective or not.
Thank you. Possibly, Bob, as the Fed assures and expands commercial credit facilities financing, is there a significant cash flow risk impact on utility access to commercial paper and short-term lending, thus making it difficult to manage short-term cash flow positions?
Is the question, have I seen evidence of that? Or is it more to which the answer is no, but haven't really studied it. Or maybe the question's more theoretic.
I honestly, I don't know. Basically just saying, is there a significant cash flow risk impact on utility access to commercial paper and short-term lending? I guess maybe is the credit market tightening. I'm not, I think that may have.
Could be, yeah. You know, I think it stands to reason that for some companies, they're going to run into borrowing constraints. I'd be surprised if, from a commercial paper standpoint, that's going to affect most regulated utilities, virtually all of whom are solidly investment grade. But I have not studied that question.
Okay, thank you. I have one question. I don't know if Jim, if you're aware of this, but the question is American Water considering discontinuing shareholder dividends in order to maintain cash flows during this crisis?
I'm not aware of that directly, but I'm not aware that we're going to do that. I'd be surprised.
Okay. That is the list of questions that I have from the attendees.
Well, thank you, Cheryl, and thank you all, and thanks to all of you who participated in our webinar this afternoon. Our next webinar will be on May 27th. We'll be discussing in more depth, a number of the topics that we discussed today. We'll be discussing deferral accounting of regulatory assets. We'll be discussing decoupling and with an eye towards doing it correctly. And John will rejoin us to talk about some of the tools that he has that might be useful for regulatory commissions as they navigate the rate issues associated with the coronavirus. I hope that you all and your families and those that you care about are all well and stay well, and so please stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again on May 27th. Thank you.
Thank you all.